anyone who's a Jewish leader, anyone who's a rabbi in particular, has got to deal with the uncertainty and the complexity of the shift. And the shift that I'm talking about historically can be looked at in all sorts of ways. I really want to focus on a shift that begins contextually with Six-Day War, post-Six-Day War, and that actually, since the Second Intifada, has catalyzed what really is a kind of destructive conversation in the Jewish community. And I'll say a few words about that in a minute, and then we're going to look at a couple of texts, not a lot of texts. We don't have a lot of time, but I want to let you know what we can accomplish, what I hope to accomplish in the short period of time we have, and what not. I'm going to say a few words more about the present and what I consider to be one of maybe the central questions within the Jewish community. At least it's one that I lose sleep over. And again, that has to do with the result of what I consider to be a paradigm shift, which has really resulted in a crisis mentality. And we'll talk about the crisis mentality. And the basis of that crisis mentality, which is a conversation that on the one hand is fueled by, framed by, motivated by fear. And so we'll come back to that. What I'd like to do is, if you look at what I passed out before you, you've got a bunch of texts. We're only going to do really one in depth, and that's Maimonides' Laws of Kings. I've given you the other texts so that you can have a resource for your own thinking about this issue. Now, the first thing I want to say in the context of this conference is, I am not suggesting that the material that we cover today give you high holiday material. In fact, I think all of you would agree it's probably the worst topic in the world to talk about on the high holidays. So this is not someone like me constantly you, but and here's some sermon material. It's not. On the other hand, one of the things that I want to explore with you this morning is deep embedded themes in these texts, and especially the Maimonides texts, that have to do simultaneously with Israel and engaging Israel, and on the other hand, actually are embedded in the high holidays. So as we go through this, I will be kind of linking some of what we're talking about with larger Jewish themes. And one of the things I want to suggest to you is, just one second, that one of the most important ways to engage in Israel, engaging with Israel, engaging with congregants, engaging with especially young people, is actually to move the conversation away from what I would call a political conversation and a conversation that is much more deeply embedded in values, Jewish values. And so my topic, from crisis to covenant, what I really mean is moving up the conversation about Israel from a crisis mentality and move it into a values narrative. And values includes here some of the big ideas embedded in Judaism, which include high holiday themes into the discussion. So what we're going to be doing is for you and for your own thinking, and not some kind of practicum on the high holidays. Karen?
Two things. I don't think there are enough texts for every person, and I'm wondering if we give you our emails afterwards, you'll be able to email this
Absolutely.
to everybody.
Yes.
And second, I may be one of many people who are sitting here who signed up to teach the course. iEngage Israel in this, and can you have that in the back of your mind?
So I will implicitly, I put for follow-up, because I don't want to talk about the practical part of iEngage. I do have materials here. This list is for me exactly to do that, for those of you who are interested in the project, which is the Hartman Institute making available materials and to induce those who aren't interested to get those materials, for those who were signed up, to get practical support on it. That'll be followed. I don't want to take the 40 minutes I have. What I want everyone to get, whether you're already signed up for the project or you're not, is what is basically the bottom line assumption of the project. And the bottom line assumption of the project is a way of thinking. A way of thinking, and a way of thinking in relation to a very specific question. And if there's anything that infuses Jewish thinking in general, and certainly the approach that the Hartman Institute takes, is to spend enough time understanding the multi-dimensions of a question, and then responding on the basis of get the question right? And then, so that's why I wanted to give you a little taste of what this issue is about intellectually, which to me is not just intellectual, it's actually existential. So, obvious. We're living in a time of just extraordinary crisis, fear, uncertainty. And also obvious, I mentioned it before. All of us are dealing with the breakdown of communication, the polarization in the community, the corruption of discourse, the inability to even have a conversation. And a lot of that has to do with basically the conversation being limited to binaries, right, wrong. And let me just share a couple of, we all have our war stories. We all have our war stories. I'm just going to give you two examples, or really one example is two narratives about one example. A bunch of years ago, not that long ago, several years ago, I worked on campus many years, and several years ago, I invited Tony Kushner to the campus. And the reason I invited Tony Kushner was because Tony Kushner, is a self-identified Jew who sees and actually implements his self-understanding as a Jew into his craft, into his art. That's very obvious, and it's done very self-consciously. And three, and for me this was extremely valuable, Tony Kushner has the extraordinary ability to actually listen. He actually, if you're in conversations with him, he actually has what Buber, Rosenzweig, what we all talk about, but it's so difficult to do, which is actually engage in dialogue. So for me, it was important for my students who are at a formative period of their life to be exposed to Tony as someone who is expressing himself in a Jewish idiom. And so we created a program that had to do about that. Jewish identity in the arts. We invited not only our own Jewish students, but we invited the campus at large, invite only, groups of people who were engaged and interested in art, meaning writing, but connected to Jewish identity. Okay? Great program. Get a call before it even begins. Board member, powerful board member. Bernie, what the hell are you doing? I said, what are you talking about? You're having Kushner, and then I get a rant and a rave. How could you? And he goes on, I said, I don't understand the problem. He says, he's anti-Israel. And I said, look, slow down. First of all, what do you mean by anti-Israel? That he's a critique of Israel, a critic of Israel? Or is there something deeper, like he negates in principle the legitimacy of a Jewish state? He says he's anti-Israel, and he doesn't believe in, and he goes on and on, not even wanting to engage in that. And so basically, it's one example of something that I know you all have many stories about that. And he basically wanted to shut down. We didn't shut it down, of course. But even when I told him that the program actually had nothing to do with Israel anyway, it didn't matter because of the depth of the irrationality. Now, I know where this guy's coming from. Deep fear, his parents were Shoah victims, etc., etc. Deep fear. So that's on the one hand. Pro-Israel, anti-Israel. Pro-Israel, that dynamic. Then the other side of that. I used to conduct seminars in Israel for students, leadership seminars, very carefully crafted to show the many sides, the nuances. I'm happy that one of the graduates of that program is here and will be a rabbi in a few years, sitting in the back row, Sarah Joshua. I hope you all get to know her. She's an HUC student now. And one of the things that I always had on that program was basically some way of enabling students to see the tensions in the dialectic in this discussion. So I had a program with the Palestinian Media Watch. Now this is right after the Second Intifada broke, or several years later. It was at the worst of the actual objective crisis, that is the conflict, suicide bombings going on all over the place. And I wanted students to have a sense of the reality of that. Now the Palestinian Media Watch, anyone here exposed to that over the years?
Sure.
Yeah? So basically paying attention primarily to television and basically creating and making available, with contextual background, the propaganda, the media propaganda campaign that was being conducted at that time by the PLO, which was actually emerging into the authority. And
educational curriculums.
To make sure that this had credibility to students, I had one of their employees who happened to be a former student of mine, who then made Aliyah to Israel, was fluent in Arabic, so she was one of the people that actually created the footage, did the editing of the footage. I had her because she was of that generation, and she was totally inside this media presentation. Showed it. The students didn't believe it. They just thought all sorts of skeptical questions. Oh yeah, you're showing a clip that's probably 3 in the morning, and we have, if you look at 3 in the morning, we've got some crazies on the tube, et cetera, et cetera. There was the cognitive dissonance between the experience of the students and what they were witnessing was so much that even in a safe context of exploration, where there was a lot of credibility for this program, and for the presenter, who had only been a recent graduate of college, some of whom even knew this student, they just couldn't believe it. So, another fault line is not pro-Israel, anti-Israel, but another has to do with, do you in any way take seriously, and how do you negotiate hope? Hope, these students are people who have their future in front of them. They are, by virtue of their age and by virtue of their sensibility, are looking forward. And they're looking at the world through the lens of hope. How do you balance that with the lens of danger? Right? So there's a generational divide. It's not pro-anti, but also younger, older, and then of course within older, younger, the sensibility divide. Are you fear-driven or hope-driven? And so how do you balance? How do you balance the ability to embrace, grasp, understand, I'm going to say this with emphasis, brute reality. The Middle East is not a playground. It's a brutal place. I mean, now even more than when this experience happened. Ability to have your eyes wide open and at the same time hope. And at the same time see the world through the lens of possibility and hope. And how do you balance that with basically the breakdown of what I consider to be one-dimensional discourse that one way or another is going to end up in destructive conversation. When we were reconvening our seating, when Zachary said, would you move over here, would you move over here? Arthur made a comment which I thought was very apt. Should we take into account the right and the left? And so that's the other, you're a right winger, you're a left winger. So what we want to do basically is take this whole discussion, moving on the level of a deeper narrative, a more nuanced narrative. And to that end, I want to show you some examples of classical texts. We picked classical texts. There are also many modern texts in here that I've given you for your own, because the modern discussion, and you can see it actually when on your own if you want to go through these, embedded in the modern discussion are the ancient, I would call them, perennial issues. And that's why I want to learn with you one of the classical texts anyway. Yeah?
I have just one comment. As we sit here as rabbis, I want to say that our paradigm of thought, danger, violence, boundaries, that's how we perceive Israel, some of us. And that paradigm of thought came into the discussion that we just heard this morning about Women of the Wall. And instead of talking about the boundaries, the danger, the separation, we should change the paradigm of thought and speech about these issues to a conversation of hope and pluralism, because there is pluralism in Israel, but we tend to focus on the danger, on the violence, on what will happen if. And
Right.
we need to change this conversation even in these matters of pluralism.
I agree, and it's an apt analogy. Let's move in, and I'll come back to addressing that. I think that it's not simply moving from fear to hope. I think it's a little more complex than that.
Yes.
I think it's embracing both and how to negotiate the tension, which is inevitable when one embraces the both. It's not hope good, danger bad. Even paranoids have enemies, and we need to deal with that. On the other hand, if you're defined by your enemies, you then end up becoming either brutal and harsh and defined by them, you give up your own identity, or you become cynical, and any kind of discussion of hope, any discussion of values becomes demeaned, because why are you talking to me about values? Why are you talking to me about peace? Why are you talking about any positive value when basically all you're doing is talking about delusional possibilities that aren't real possibilities, and that's dangerous. So to me, the question is how to negotiate the tension, not one or the other. Okay? So look at the table of contents, and I want to just point to the first couple of texts. So we're not going to go in there. We're not going to have time. But just so that you can see, if we're talking about a narrative, obviously it makes sense to start with Torah, a Torah narrative. And basically, the tension I'm talking about is deeply embedded in the narrative, the Torah narrative, and the Torah narrative over the generations. And the reason that's important is if we're talking about shifting the grounds of the conversation, then it's critical to understand that our reaction to what was in the New York Times this morning, or our reaction to something that happened even 10 years ago, historically, is too limited. We need a deeper lens through which to see what's happening in the here and now. And so the Breakout text, the first one, basically, you can turn to it. I'm pointing at it and talking at you. I want to get to the Rambam. Look at the bottom. This is the famous, to me, one of the most moving passages in the Torah in context. I would have loved and would love sometime to just study this text with you alone. The context of this text is a fear context, right? It's Jacob returning to the land and encountering Esau along the way, and it's a text that's defined by fear. It starts off with Vayira, Vayitzer. There are two dimensions of fear, that meaning the whole context of this story is about fear and the depth of Jacob's fear. We're not going through it. But then there's a transformational moment in the middle It's actually a process, but a climactic one in the middle, wrestling with the Ish. And then on the other end, the transformation ends up in this extraordinary reconciliation between Esau and Yaakov. Vayaratz Esav likrato v'yachabehu v'yipol al tzavaro v'yishkahehu v'yivku. Just extraordinary. They meet, they embrace, they kiss, and most importantly, they weep together. Look at the verbs. That's where the moment of coming together is the weeping. Beautiful text. Turn to the next page, and you'll see this is the Rashi, and
What page?
page 2. You may have different. It's just. Yeah, okay. Basically, what Rashi does is present the midrashic argument over this, and basically you have a tradition, a rabbinic tradition, Chazal, that basically totally flips that upside down. The kissing isn't kissing, it's biting. Esau, we know as a halacha, halachahi b'yadua she'esav sonel Yaakov. Esau is a perennial enemy, and of course becomes a paradigm for Rome, and then all throughout history. And so, right here, you see in the narrative the depth to which we've got this view that there are enemies, we're defined by our enemies are implacable, there's nothing we can do about it except assume defensive roles. We see the world through the lens of suspicion, distrust. The text after that, I'm not even going to read at you, but basically it's the famous text of Bilam's bracha to the Jewish people, which ends up including Am levad yishkon v'gayin lo yitashev. Oh, and here's this great blessing that we should be alone and isolated forever from the rest of the world. So there's actually a Jewish aspiration, in this text. I should have turned it off. That's basically one of building into our very self-definition that we should be isolated and cut off. So we have deep within our tradition a narrative of fear and suspicion. To the extent that it actually ends up being definitional for us, and that verse that I quoted from Bilam that's here, I'm sure that some of you remember this. It was probably among the most quoted verses of Menachem Begin. It's quoted, in public discourse in Israel in many ways, and it sort of basically says, this is who we are. When we look at the UN, when we look at this, forget it. We're dealing with a deeper problem. It cannot be resolved by anything as radical, delusional as transformation, change, let alone reconciliation. Okay? Then we have texts which are really familiar to you. I brought Devarim, and I brought Shemot, that basically are aspirational texts. They deal with the meaning of the covenant. The aspiration to be an Am Kadosh, an Am Skula, and basically the shift into the realm of covenant is a shift in the realm of aspiration to hope to be something beyond who you are, which assumes the possibility of transformation. So all of those texts basically I'm using just to show you the depth of this tension. Fear, hope. Brute realism is as only defend yourself, protect yourself, and on the other hand, aspiration to transcend a present reality and to find yourself in value terms. I'm not going into those texts, they're really familiar to you. I just want you to show how they line up in this. Now go to the Rambam, which is on page 4, and we'll spend basically the rest of the time with this because we don't have a lot of time. But what I want to suggest to you is that this text of the Rambam, which is from Hilchot Malachim, which is the very last chapter of his 14-volume Mishnah Torah that describes his messianic vision. And the reason that I'm bringing specifically this text is it simultaneously is literally sort of the last word of the Mishnah Torah, but more importantly, it deals explicitly with Israel, and it deals with Israel explicitly, or implicitly anyway, in terms of the move from a crisis narrative that's based on fear or enemies and danger, and moves it to the realm of hope, and hope is articulated in particular ways. So what's important as I go through this text is the logic of the Rambam. This isn't about let's exhaust this text, but it's also not, oh, here's a text that supports what I think. Oh, isn't that cool? The Rambam, as you know, is a great systematizer, very clear thinker. And to me, one of the things that has made the Rambam my Rebbe for at least the last 30 years is that he combines something that I think is very unusual in anybody, let alone someone whose thinking is so kind of classical. And that is profound depth, spiritual depth, emotional depth, on the one hand, and on the other hand, intellectual clarity. And I think that kind of thinking is exactly what we need. We need to be clear thinkers. Clear thinking isn't necessarily the way it's understood in this conflict we're living in today of, oh, that means hard-nosed thinking, that means cynical thinking. He's got depth and he's got clarity, and that's a hard combination to beat. So let's look at this. So we're gonna be following the sequence of his thought. Al Yaleh al Halev Shabimot HaMashiach. You know what? Okay. Yital Davar Miminhago Shalom O Yesham Kiddush B'Maaseh Bereshit Ela Olam Minhago Holeh, or other versions no hey. Basically, don't think when you're hoping for the great future. Don't think that there's going to be anything in this world that changes. That is, anything essential. That is, human nature isn't going to change. Any reality that we understand as reality, whatever the categories of reality are, that's not going to change because the world goes according to its normal course. What Maimonides is laying down here is, you know what? There's a reality. You better embrace it. You better probe it. Don't sugarcoat reality. Whatever the content is, whether it's political, whether it's psychological, do your homework, be strong-minded, open your eyes fully to reality. So the first thing I ask myself is a question, oh, great, Maimonides, here we're coming to your great messianic hope, and messianic hope to me is just hope. Use it as a category, a phenomenological category of hope. So, oh, I hope that I'll survive the next 2 minutes. Great, what's that? In other words, it basically is an anti-hope premise. It's an anti-hope premise. I mean, if you just stop here, he's basically saying, stop dreaming. Just don't dream. But of course, he moves on to, that's the question. But then he moves on and he says, oh, actually, now just look at the bold. But Amru Chachamim ein beino olam hazeh limot hamashiach ela shibud malchiot bilvad. Oh, actually, if you grasp that reality is really something you can't change, oh, but there will be a change. There's a bit of a paradox here. There actually will be a change. What's that change? That change is Jewish sovereignty. That's basically what he's talking. The burden of living in Galut in the nation, and we're going to actually return to Jewish sovereignty. Now, if you think for a minute about what he just did, it's just extraordinary. Here's a guy living in the 12th century, celebrates his bar mitzvah by fleeing from the Almohades. Literally. Goes to Morocco, greeted by the Almohades. Leaves, goes to Israel. Gets off the boat at Akko, goes to Jerusalem, to the Kotel. We have a letter where he's actually describing his experience at the Kotel. It's not like Hava Nagila, it's welcome Rambam, the Crusaders. Right, so he's between Islam, Christianity, and their war, and of course then goes to Egypt. So here's a guy who, in his own historic and existential situation that's brutal, absolutely brutal, can write, oh, and by the way, I can imagine a time without miracles, without anything that's crazy utopian. I can imagine, actually, that the Jewish people are going to return to the land of Israel. Okay? Now, until our own century, I probably would have been one of the first to say, you're crazy, Rambam. What are you talking about? This is utopian. But the truth is that his utopian vision is the reality that we experience in our lifetime. And so, the pole of hope doesn't transcend his premises of reality, but he pushes the power of transformational change to the limit of reality. That's his frame. AJ, that's his frame, yeah.
You said that it's a time when no miracles, it's been reality, but it's Yimot HaMashiach. Mashiach's there. I mean, it's
Yeah, but the point
That seems
is,
to be more-
he's the one that's telling us. He's the one that's telling us, and it's in this text too, but we're not going to focus on it, that the Nevi'im talk about the Messiah time as being all this miraculous stuff happening. We've got Midrashim. He negates that whole tradition. And so what he's doing is redefining messianic hope in realistic terms. And not only realistic terms, but the main category is political. It's political sovereignty. Okay? So that's point one. That his frame is this tension between reality and then hope, pushing hope to the limit, but not breaking the framework of reality. Look down in Dalet. After talking in Gimel, after talking about all these traditional texts that talk about this big apocalyptic situation, the war of Gog and Magog, apocalyptic thinking. We're in a time now we're beginning to think a little apocalyptic. He said, forget all that. Forget all that. Why do we forget the traditional texts that talk about apocalypse, that talk about miracle, that talk about that? Very simple. I'm sorry, I skipped on to Dalet. Go to Dalet. Very simple. Lo yeda adam hechav hiyu ad shiyu. We don't know. It's an epistemological point. It's a point that basically says you cannot, the human mind cannot, should not understand political events in metaphysical terms. The mind cannot know. And one of the things he's stating here is, by the way, when you hope, do not make your hope contingent upon certainty. I think one of the great themes of this holiday is, when we're talking about Norah or Yira, how do you deal with the awe and the fear? Awe is one thing, fear is another, that catalyzes uncertainty. How do you live with uncertainty? And one of the ways we live with uncertainty is by trying to basically make things more certain that give us permission to hope. And so part of the discussion in the community that's breaking down is there's such uncertainty. We need certainty. And when you're looking for certainty, you can't hope. And so you've got to be aware of what is the limit of what you can expect or not expect. And so that's his first point here. A second point, which is more important, is if you look at the bottom that's of Dalet, Ein sidur chabayot tavarim ele v'lo tiktukechem ikar adat. Oh, and by the way, all the speculation doesn't lead to ikar badat, a principle in religion. And that's where Maimonides is basically moving us from reality to a language of values. He's saying, when we hope, when we envision this political change that's going to happen in reality, it is political. But what's it about? We've got to look at it first and foremost by the standard of what does it mean? What does it stand for? What are the ikarim, the basic principles that define it? And then, in the very next halakha, hey, he then tells us what those principles are. And the principles to Maimonides are, last line, futile speculation, einan umavi'in loli de ahava v'loli de yira. They don't move us to ahava v'yira. And yira here, to Maimonides, is awe. It's not fear. And just contextually, the reason he singles out these two is because in the Maimonidean corpus, the whole purpose of being a human being and being a human being Jewishly is in order to balance off another tension, and that's the tension between awe and love. Love to Maimonides is the capacity to break out of the prison of your own narcissism. That's what love is. Love is the almost erotic compulsion to connect with God, and he translates that also into human relationships. They go together. It's the aspiration to get out of self and create bonds of connection that do not. Awe is the sense of the bigness of something. Love is the sense also that you have the capacity to choose. It's human agency. Awe is the sense of the limit of your ability to choose. And so that's just a way of saying that he's using big categories. You could use other big categories, but he's using big categories, love and awe of God, as a way to frame the political meaning of Israel. And those two categories to me are actually very rich. He then, look at the next page, 5. He's dealing with power, sovereignty. It's very important that if he's going to redefine our hope in political terms, is politics and sovereignty an end in itself? And here, lo nitavu hanavi'im v'chachamim yemot haMashiach, lo chadei sheyishlatu ha'olam. By the way, we're not thinking about all this. There's going to be a transformation, but if you think for 1 minute this is about domination of others, and I think it's very important, by the way, that Maimonides' critique here of power is important in a time when I talk about a paradigm shift. Well, one of the paradigm shifts that we're in, the big one, I'm just reminding you of what you know, that we are a generation that experienced the deepest vulnerability to danger, the fulfillment of our nightmares, the Shoah, and the return of Jewish sovereignty, the Jewish people, in the same generation. We are the people post-Holocaust in America who've developed the most powerful community, powerful in terms of politics, powerful in terms of economics, powerful in terms of our capacity, social capacity to interact. It's status now to marry a Jew. People are buying chuppahs because Chelsea was married under a chuppah. Non-Jews are buying chuppahs. I mean, this is a stat. The chuppah, these chuppah companies that have these sort of prefab chuppahs, after that wedding, it shot up something like 30%. We've got power, and on the other hand, we also are facing extraordinary enemies that I don't have to tell you about. And so how do you balance off power? Well, you understand that power is a means to a greater end. You lose the end, then you become infatuated with power. And I want to say, we all become infatuated with power. We all become infatuated. When I lived in Israel many years and I came back, and so it was sort of like a Rip Van Winkle kind of thing. You hear language differently than you heard it before. Things sound really weird, even though you know the words. One of the things that was weird was power breakfast. Everyone's having a power breakfast. In this community, the status of people who have power. A rabbi's got power. How do you deal with power? How do you deal with power? Or how do you deal with vulnerability? So one of the great themes of Ahava V'yira is, how do you deal with power? Embracing it, using it, but at the same time, embrace your vulnerability. So the end can't be political power. This isn't about how proud we are in Israel. And not in order, basically self-aggrandizement. He's going to end by basically saying, in this period of time, I'm in Pet, we're going to live in a time that's transformational, and somehow he believes that we human beings can actually do this. We can bring it on ourselves. And then he's got a vision, basically, of a society of Israel whose aspiration is spiritual growth and intellectual growth, and that's part of a world order, a global society. That's why it's so amazing to me that he wrote this in the 12th century, where there's a global society which is dedicated to the interdependence of bringing into being the highest values that Jews can bring to the world order and have a relationship with the world. So basically what you see in terms of the logic of Maimonides, and I know I shot a lot of stuff. I'm going to end here, and because I want to take a couple of questions, I apologize that this has been totally frontal. Maimonides basically incorporates into his hope an awareness of the need not only to embrace reality, but to embrace power. Embrace power. We need power. And we need political power. Because guess what? Yes, there are dangers out there. And we need power, and we need political power in order to basically address those real issues, which are not going away. He rejects the possibility that there's ever going to be a time in the world order where there won't be struggle. At the same time, we need to be really clear of what we can know and can't know, because our fears create delusions and our hopes create delusions. And so know the limitation of the human mind. That's that phrase, how can we know something? Know that we can't know everything, and therefore part of the struggle has got to be, how do we live with uncertainty without uncertainty basically freaking us out? He then moves and says, and by the way, let's be really clear that we need to articulate our highest aspirations. That's the end of this. Now, every one of us has the ability to have our own vision, to build into the vision the values that matter. I skipped over a couple of things because I was going too quickly. Peace. He brought peace in early as one of the major values of this of imagining this, but it's peace in the context of what we've been talking about. So I want to end here just because we've run out of time, and I'll take a couple of questions from the floor at the risk of going too far over. Yeah.
I'm going to say something that's probably not very politically correct, which is I respectfully have a different thesis, which is this is not a generational crisis. This is a crisis along denominational lines. In the traditional and modern Orthodox world, you do not have this binary, polar, all-out war. Are we now shoulder to shoulder with Israel, or are we ashamed / highly critical of Israel? This is, in my view, symptomatic of the overall existential crisis in terms of Jewish identity and liberal Judaism that manifests itself also in many other ways, including assimilation.
Okay. We can continue that discussion. I found it interesting that you chose to frame your words, excuse me for being not politically incorrect, but perhaps not particularly polite as a speaker. But one of the main points I wanted to make here is let's stop thinking in terms of binaries. And I noticed that you talked about orthodoxy as being one thing and then liberals. What I would like to suggest to you is that within the Orthodox world, there are greater complexities than that. And within the liberal world, there are extraordinary complexities. And one of the reasons that I brought a Rambam text, however, we didn't have a lot of time, but because the Rambam text is the legacy of all of us. We all own the Rambam text. And the Rambam text, to me, actually includes many of the nuances that break down the category liberal, break down the category Orthodox. Okay, anything else? Yeah, Martha?
Not to make it simplistic, but I do need some help here, which is when I look at the generations,
Yep.
especially the generation Gimel that's often used in Israel, and the first generation, often those who are tied into leadership in the Jewish community, help create the state of Israel. The next generation, tied in very often to the parents, grandparents, who have now helped to defend Israel. And then we have Generation Gimel that doesn't have that same type of history, the same type of connection. And how do we speak to all three of those and get them to, in a sense, have a sense of hope? Because their experiences are very different. There's some wisdom there.
I think that one has to really take into account the splits. One of the splits is generational. It's not only, I agree with you there, Tom, it's not only generational. I think that my take, and this is based on really 18 years on a campus, and this is going to sound to be not practical, it's the most practical thing in the world. There's nothing more practical than following. Move the conversation, as I said earlier, away from a political argument. Go to a deeper place. If we had 2 hours to study just this Rambam text, if we sat down and did this the way I actually have done it for many years with young people, where you got time to just, this is about a text. This isn't let's unravel this text. Let's argue with it. Let's understand what it says and then discuss it. It opens up space for students to move in and be in touch with their deeper feelings. So I'm not representing the Student Progressive Alliance, or I'm not representing the Orthodox Minyan, or I'm not representing anything, but I'm looking in myself. This is what text study enables when you can do it. It enables students to touch into deeper feelings and thoughts that they have because they're not coming with labels. Text study does it. I taught this very text with the same generation you're talking about, and it opens up space for the discussion. The second thing is that when you're discussing a text and its applications to the present, just be brutally honest and invite that with students. It's like, you know what? What does the text say? How do you understand the text? And be honest, and don't be apologetic. Do not be apologetic. If there's anything that students and young people are allergic to, absolutely allergic to, it's pretense. You know, one of the fault lines I would say in the community between the older and younger generation is sort of the affirmation of self-importance of people within the Jewish establishment, especially many who are engaged in Israel and love sitting in front of a prime minister and love to say, oh yes, and I talked to this person and that person. That's a turnoff to young people. They're looking for something more real than simply that kind of, I would say, idolatry. Okay? One more question. Yeah. Yeah. I'll just take one more. Is that okay? One more.